Welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. This week we wrap up our three-part series on Paul McCartney in 1979 and 1980 with a track-by-track look at McCartney II. In these three cubicles, I put some of the new and notable albums you might have seen on prominent display in the record store when it was released on May 16, 1980, just short of a year after Wings' last album, Back to the Egg. Before we get started, I wanted to let everybody know that the second part of my discussion with Betamax Blocker is up on his YouTube channel. It continues our freewheeling, informal discussion of Beach Boys box sets. It was a lot of fun, and he's always got interesting perspectives. You can check it out at Betamax Blocker here on YouTube. Getting back to McCartney II, we already discussed the album opener coming up in detail last time. It gets McCartney II off to a good start. It's a strong, catchy, thoroughly enjoyable track. By contrast, the album's second track, Temporary Secretary, is one of the more annoying tracks McCartney had ever released up to this point. It sounds like it's meant to make you dance with jerky robot movements. The chorus, which is just temporary secretary, repeated in a deliberately aggravating voice with some vocal interjections that sound like angry bird calls, is especially grating. Musically and lyrically, it's full of the modern irony that was part of the zeitgeist and best exemplified by Devo and the B-52s. Because of that, it also comes across as one of the most derivative tracks on the album. At best, it might be a failed parody of a musical style that was already a parody in itself. McCartney himself said it was a little influenced by Ian Drury. For some reason, it was released as a 12-inch A-side in the UK only on September 19th. It's not an extended mix or anything, it's just the standard 3-minute, 13-second album track. The B-side is the previously unreleased 10-minute and 30-second Secret Friend. Secret Friend starts out promisingly, sounding very ethereal and very Brian Eno-esque. It morphs into kind of a Latin dance-influenced track. It's actually quite nice. Like coming up, McCartney's vocal is treated. It's more extreme in this case, and I think it works to the detriment of the song, which could have been grounded and strengthened by a more natural-sounding vocal. It's probably the most interesting of the electronica experiments that McCartney recorded and cut from the album. It makes me wonder if the release of Temporary Secretary as a 12-inch had more to do with McCartney's desire to see Secret Friend released than anything else. Getting back to the album, we pick up with track 3. The bluesy throwaway, On the Way, sounds the most like something we might have heard on the original McCartney album, apart from the heavy echo on the vocals. McCartney said that this and Nobody Knows, which closes out side 1, were inspired by the blues documentary series The Devil's Music, hosted by Alexis Korner. On the Way is nice enough, and it brings a little variety to the album. It's also slight and forgettable, and the kind of thing McCartney could put together in his sleep. Next up is Waterfalls, which was released as a single in the UK on June 13th, with another session left over, Check My Machine, on the B-side. The US release didn't come until July 22nd. That's why I have the UK version. It had a non-album B-side, and I wasn't going to risk missing it by waiting around to see if it got released here. The B-side, Check My Machine, was, as you might guess, an experiment by McCartney to check his recording equipment. It's been assumed it was the first thing recorded for the project, though McCartney says the first recording was Front Parlour. I've read that it was probably made when he checked his equipment after it was moved from his home in Peasmarsh, where recording began, to his home in Scotland. It begins with voices taken from the 1957 Warner Brothers cartoon Tweet Zoo saying, "Hi, George. Morning, Terry." As you might expect, it's a simple, improvised, rather monotonous recording, good enough for a B-side maybe, but not much else. Waterfalls is a beautiful track and certainly an album highlight. A promotional video was created for Waterfalls. It's unique in being the only song on the album that McCartney had started writing prior to the sessions. He said it was a leftover from the last Wings album. It is slow, almost to the point of being dirge-like, and to my ears it's always sounded a little unfinished. I'm always aware he's just going back and forth between the "Don't Go Jumping Waterfalls" part and the "I Need Love" part. It really seems like a middle 8 was in order, and I'm really surprised that McCartney, of all people, didn't add one. It didn't have the obvious commercial appeal of Coming Up, but looking at the other tracks on McCartney II, it was the obvious choice for the second single. As always with the McCartney album, there's lots of pleasant tracks, but this, Coming Up, and the album Closer, which we'll get to in a moment, are definitely my favorite tracks. The single got to number 9 in the UK. Despite the promo clip seeming to get a lot of play on various TV shows in the US, it'll become the first regular McCartney single ever to miss the Billboard Hot 100, going only as high as 106. Side 1 closes with Nobody Knows. It's the kind of loose rocker with undisciplined vocals that McCartney seemed to like to close the first sides of his albums with. See also Man We Was Lonely on McCartney and Smile Away on Ram. Like On the Way, it's a little more like something we might have heard on the McCartney album. Also like On the Way, it's enjoyable enough, but also ultimately lightweight and forgettable. Side 2 gets back to electronica with the bouncy, pseudo-East Asian flavored front parlor. Like the rest of the album, it's pleasant enough, but so simple that it feels much longer than its actual 3-minute 30-second running time. Summer's Day song, which follows, was originally another instrumental. Simple words were added to it late in the process, I would guess in an attempt to beef up the contents and make it appear there were more finished songs on the album. The music is somber, almost stately. McCartney talked about it being influenced by classical music. It's a track I enjoy. The instrumentation does evoke the languid humidity of a summer's day. When speaking publicly about his recent troubles in Japan, McCartney was unfailingly polite and blamed nobody but himself. In Japan, the next track on McCartney II is called Frozen Japanese. In the rest of the world, the title is 2 syllables shorter, turning it into an insult that metaphorically raised a middle finger to the country that had jailed him for 9 days. McCartney, of course, pointed out that the track was recorded long before his trip to Japan and said that the title was just something he had scribbled down on the tape box to remind him of what the song sounded like and that the title stuck. Maybe so, but under the circumstances, he also undoubtedly knew how the title was going to be interpreted by everyone else and let it stand. As you might guess, it's another East Asian flavored instrumental. It's pleasant and bouncy like Front Parlor. Both songs are about the same length. This one feels shorter. This 3-track sequence that starts side 2 has always sounded to me like McCartney was trying to channel Eno's Another Green World. The result is an enjoyable enough sequence, but McCartney never approaches the kind of spark and gravitas that Eno brought to the genre, which, after all, he largely helped create. McCartney can and has, of course, written some of the greatest popular songs of all time. Maybe it's because he's so steeped in popular music that this kind of spacey, ethereal, proto-ambient work just isn't a natural fit for him. I know if Paul McCartney walks into a room full of musical instruments, passes by the piano and a guitar, and sits down at a synthesizer, I'm going to immediately reduce my expectations. As explained and described in a special note on the lyrics section of the inner sleeve, the next track, Bogey Music, came out of recordings McCartney undertook for a proposed soundtrack to a proposed film of Raymond Briggs' children's book, Fungus the Bogeyman. To paraphrase Spinal Tap, there's a thin line between whimsical and stupid, and when he starts messing around with children's music, McCartney often misses it. I've got to believe McCartney knew the critics would single out this track for abuse. It probably would have been okay for its intended purpose on the soundtrack of a kid's movie. I'm really stymied as to why he put this on McCartney II, especially when it's an album where he otherwise seems to be striving to reestablish some artistic credibility. I can only guess that it's the kind of thing that McCartney really enjoyed. At 2 minutes and 18 seconds, Darkroom is the shortest track on the album. On an album of simple songs, it's one of the simplest, boiling down to almost a series of chants set against an Eno-esque backing track invoking a jungle setting. If he'd made it a little shorter, he could have used it as a tag or link. As a standalone song, it's a throwaway. When I first heard the album, it was the last track, One of These Days, where I finally got what I really wanted from McCartney II. It wasn't him trying to be current like Gary Newman or an experimental artist like Brian Eno. It was McCartney doing one of the things he does best, an acoustic ballad that spoke from the heart. It felt much more real than anything else on the album, even including a strong track like Coming Up. With everybody going new wave in 1980, McCartney could pick up an acoustic guitar and, metaphorically, paint with colors that nobody else was using. A few more like One of These Days and he would have been an artist responding to current trends rather than trying to fit in with them. It has a depth and a sincerity that makes it, for me, the standout track. As usual, the critics were harsh. Rolling Stone called McCartney II an album of oral doodles designed for the amusement of very young children. Continuing that, most of the songs are merely sound effects, and that its catchiest numbers make the singer's voice sound like a cross between an insect and a wind-up toy. McCartney II will go to number 3 in the US, which pretty much anybody except McCartney would have seen as a huge hit. For McCartney, it represented an improvement over Wings' last album, Back to the Egg, which only went to number 8. But, as mentioned last time, apart from the number 10 Wildlife in 1971, every other original McCartney and/or Wings album had gone to number 1 or number 2. In a 1986 interview, McCartney reflected, "Synthesizers are cold and thin. They don't sound like real instruments sometimes," and mused that he might have done something different. McCartney was back to rehearsing and demoing new material with Wings in the summer of 1980. A lot of the songs were no great improvement over what he'd been doing, songs like Sweetest Little Show and Average Person. There was some markedly better stuff mixed in as well, like Tug of War and Wanderlust. Wings also worked on soundtrack songs for a proposed Rupert the Bear animated film. It's hard to imagine where McCartney thought he was going and why he wanted to go there. He seemed to be heading toward making a paler version of London Town at best, or at worst, becoming a writer and performer of children's novelty songs. A lot of critics during this period and into the 80s accused McCartney of pandering with overly cute, overly sweet, simplistic songs. I have a different theory. I think songs he wrote during this period, like Ode to a Koala Bear, Ebony and Ivory, and We All Stand Together, are what McCartney really, truly enjoyed. If he did any pandering, it was for the critics. During some phases of his solo career, at least, he made his best records, not because he wanted to, but at least in part to try to get the critics off his back. He said as much about Ram. I think it'll be much the same when his next album, Tug of War, finally emerges in 1982. It's a great album, but I think he'd really rather have done a Rupert the Bear soundtrack. Of course, between McCartney II and his next album, everything will be derailed and turned upside down by the unexpected, senseless, and tragic death of John Lennon. Under the circumstances, it seemed unlikely that any former Beatle would ever tour again. Wings had been winding down, and with touring out of the equation, there was no sense in keeping up the pretense. There was no announcement. Wings just faded away. It'll be nearly 2 years before McCartney releases his next album. When he does, we can at least enjoy that it will be his strongest album in many, many years. I hope you enjoyed this off-topic series. As always, I look forward to your comments. Next week, we'll be back to the Beach Boys with a look at their appearances on series television in the 80s and 90s. Hope you'll join me for that. Meanwhile, have a great week. Thanks for watching. Please hit like if you don't mind and subscribe if you haven't. Bye.